Hello. As part of the Acastemi project, we will now start third hybrid seminar, organized in this case by the Institute of Education at University of Lisbon. As usual, this seminar will have a first part, which will be held via video conference by our invited speakers, but we also have some future teachers in the room with us. And we'll have a second part in which we will discuss the issues raised during this first part with those present in the room. We have two invited speakers, Professor Luís Golão and Professor Anabela Raimundo. Professor Luís Golão has a PhD in agronomic engineering and a postgraduate in sustainable agriculture. He is professor and Vice Dean of the School of Agriculture at University of Lisbon. His research and teaching bridge agriculture, food security and nutrition with food policy and development outcomes. Professor Anabela Raimundo is a chemical engineer with a master in food science and technology and a PhD in food engineering. She is associated professor with habilitation at the School of Agriculture at University of Lisbon. Her main research is focused on the use of poorly exploited food sources for the development of high-value products. We'd like to thank both for accepting our invitation, and now I will give the floor to Professor Luís Golão, who will make the first intervention.
A professor and a researcher at the School of Agriculture from this University of Lisbon, and I was challenged to speak to you a bit about sustainable agriculture for people and planet. My main interest is, of course, global sustainability of food production, but with an emphasis on tropical regions and the developing countries. So as you will see from my presentation, I will try to give a snapshot of the most relevant what sustainability is different when we consider the global north context and the global south context, okay? And this is important for people and planet. I will try to organize this as very light, like a story. And then we can discuss, if you are interested in more detailed concepts, you can discuss it after the presentation. Se eu tiver o texto lá, ou então eu vou para aí. Se calhar eu vou para aí. Okay. Since the topic is sustainability, sustainable agriculture. A câmera apanha?
Sentado, sim.
Se calhar. I prefer to speak standing, but I need the keyboard. Estou a passar os slides. É por isso que estou aqui. Okay, sorry for this logistics. So since I'm focusing on sustainability, I will start with the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, I think you all are acquainted with this framework. So the United Nations comes up with this framework for development, and I will start focusing on sustainable development too, since we are speaking about agriculture and food production. Sustainable Development Goal 2 is about zero hunger, and if we see in the very brief and top description of Sustainable Development Goal 2, zero hunger, it says end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. So the topic of sustainable agriculture is part of the goal of achieving the zero hunger objective. Not only because agriculture produces food, but the word sustainable is clearly explicit in the framework. if we look at the map of global hunger in the world, and I start with this map in 1992, we see that, of course, the issue was only focused on the global south. We see that particularly sub-Saharan Africa and some regions in Asia are those who face severe hunger. Europe and North America are gray, not because they don't have food insecurity or hunger, but because in 1992 it was considered that hunger and food insecurity was not an issue for developed countries. So there is no data. Of course, we know that this is not true, and we have hunger and food insecurity in all countries in the world. But this was giving an emphasis on the availability of food. Those countries, if they cannot produce food, they can import food. So availability of food is guaranteed. And in 1992, in this the last period of the last century, hunger and food insecurity was not considered to be an issue of developed countries. But when we look at the same map in 2021, we can observe very immediate reaction is that we have lighter colors, right? So it seems that hunger decreased in the world from 1992 to 2021. And if we go in the previous period from the 60s, for example, the decrease would be even more significant. So this was a positive thing and something that was, the world was in the right trend. However, we know that for decades, the number of hungry people has been declining, but this is not true anymore. So since 2015-16, the trend of decreasing of hunger in the world was reverted. And we are observing an increase in people with hunger and food insecurity, both in number of people and in percentage. And this is important because, as we know, the population is growing exponentially. But also in percentage, we are seeing an increase. One clarification here, hungry is considered lack of calories, not enough energy to survive. Food insecurity is when we can have some energy, some calories, but we don't have proper nutrition. So we miss micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals. And we know that we have from 750 to 800 million people facing hunger in the world in 2020, more than 2.3 billion people from undernutrition, so lack of minerals, vitamins, micronutrients, proper nutrition, and about the same number, 2 billion to 2.5 billion of people with overweight and obesity, which is also a form of malnutrition. So this is all of this have with food and with food consumption, lower than needed or higher than needed. And this is what I'm talking to you. Since 2015-16, we can see that the trend of decrease of hunger and food insecurity in the world was reverted. Of course, we have this big slope in 2019-20 from the COVID pandemics, and then the expected from the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But the world is now facing again an urge in food insecurity. What is food security? Because in the first slide we saw that there is a mention to hungry and food insecurity, so it should be different. Hungry is, as I told you, a lack of energy to survive. Traditionally, there are 4 pillars of food security definition, and I'm saying tradition. You will see why, because the concept has been evolving, and the concept is that all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. This means that this is not only to have sufficient food. People must have also access to food they can be able to buy it, and they should utilize it according to good practices. So the four pillars are related: availability to having sufficient food, both from production, and here is where agriculture is relevant, but also for imports. Access is the social and economic possibility to have access to food. It's not enough to have food available. People should be able to access to them, to eat, to food. And then food utilization. The food should be utilized in a safe way and preserving the nutritious characteristics of it, the diets, the way of cooking, the way of storage. And then all people at all times, food stability. If there is a drought, if there is a conflict, people should not be in a situation not having enough food. So availability is necessary, but not enough. One should have accessibility and then proper utilization at all times. And the concept has been evolving from in the 70s of the last century. The focus was only on availability and stability. So this was an issue of agriculture and trade of agricultural commodities. Then in the 80s, the shift changed to highlight the importance of having access from vulnerable people to the food. Even when the food is available, there was a period called the Green Revolution in which during which the productions, the yields increased significantly. So the problem of not having enough food was not that relevant. But the understanding is that vulnerable people don't have access even when the food exists. And this changed a bit from the social economic perspective. In the last decade of the century, a focus was given on utilization, so highlighting the importance of food being nutritious, of the diets, and the safety of food. And now the four pillars are clearly recognized, and there is some special rules for food security being discussed at the United Nations level. There is a special rule of prenatal nutrition for healthy reproductive life, and we know that children that don't have enough nutrients, vitamins, and minerals have impairments in their development, both physical and cognitive. So this is a development issue. Having a good nutrition in the first 2 years of life. And I'm moving to the sustainability part. Cultural, appropriate, and environmental sustainable food. So including giving importance to the way that the food is produced and what people eat, culturally appropriate, and a role for food production, not only to feed people, but for territorial cohesion and rural development, keeping, particularly in the global north, keeping people in the rural areas and developing the rural areas through agriculture. And I mentioned traditionally 4 pillars, but now we have the discussion and an agreement, a global agreement, that 2 additional pillars should be included in the concept of food security. So the concept of food security is still evolving and being regularly updated. And these 2 additional pillars are agency, and agency means that people should be able to choose, to make the options about what they eat and the way that their food is produced. So there is these movements of people that only eat local food, or only they are vegetarians, or they only eat seasonal products. So agency, or only organic food. Okay, so people should be able to choose not only the food, but the way the food is produced and by whom. And the other pillar is sustainability, and we are now building on this initial idea. And sustainability means that adds on the dimension of stability, that now is considered short term, so avoiding shocks in 1 year or during a short period, and sustainability is for the long term. The future generations being able to make use of the same resources that we are doing. So the same concept, food security, is a situation that exists when all people, and the all people has to do with agency at all times, and all times has to do with stability and sustainability, have physical, social, and economic access on the access pillar to sufficient availability, safe and nutritious food that meets the dietary needs, utilization, and food preferences, again, agency, for an active and healthy life. So we have some concepts that are now being discussed and gaining traction in developed countries on the concept of food security. But the world is not the same. So now I will very fast pass through some maps and some pictures just to show the similarities in the world. So we started by looking at this map, the global hunger, and we see we're not focusing on specific countries, but in the regions that are facing hunger are the global south, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. Just focus on sub-Saharan Africa for the message that I want to convey here. When we look at moderate or severe food insecurity, so not only calories, but also a good diet, we see the same region. When we look at hidden hunger, which is, again, minerals, vitamins, and micronutrients, the same region is affected. When we look at the Human Development Index, which is not only economic, but includes other dimensions like gender, like democracy, access to information. Okay, this is a composite index. We see the negative of the previous slides. So food insecurity is inversely correlated with development. And when we look at the daily supply of calories per person, we see that the same region, of course, has a lower daily supply of calories. Doesn't mean that this is too low. Maybe in this case, the global north is in excess here, but the message is that it's different. When we see the protein supply, very low. So not only food, but also diversity of food is different in the global south. When we see about fruits and vegetables, which is very, very, very important, all the global south is below dietary guidelines. And when we now look at this economic part, the GDP per capita is very low in the same countries. But the GDP from agriculture, the share of GDP from agriculture, not the amount, okay? The share is very high in the same region. So in these regions, agriculture is the main economic driver. Most economic revenues come from the agricultural sector, which is kind of a paradox. When the communities and the regions that live from agriculture are those that are facing hunger and food insecurity. But when we see the yields, okay, the productivity, we see that they are very low. So the GDP, that's why the GDP of those countries is very low, because it relies on agriculture mostly, but the profit from the agricultural sector is low. And we can see here very different trends on this. We see here China, Angola, and Portugal as three cases, and in which we can see that we can obtain, in this case, cereal yields from two strategies. Okay, here in China, we can see in the red line an increase in the production of cereal that is not followed by an expansion of land used to produce the cereal, which is this line, this bottom line here. Okay, so in the same land, in the same area of land, more cereal can be produced because the yields increased, and this is due to better ways of producing. When we look at Portugal, we see that there is a kind of stable, a steady rate of production of cereals, but we are using less land in Portugal. So this is also due to increase in yields. So better technology, better ways of producing. But when we look at Angola as a representative country in sub-Saharan Africa, we see that the increase in the production of cereal is related to an increase on the land, on the area used to produce the cereal, because the yields, the productivity is not improving. Okay, so this is very different according to different regions. And following on this map, we can also see that the share of labor force employed in agriculture is hugely high in the same regions. Okay, so in the regions where people are mostly farmers, and agriculture contributes to the economy, are those where people face hunger and malnutrition, which is we can explain it, but it's a bit on a paradox. And why? Because the value added per worker is very low in the same region. So people work in agriculture, but add little value to their activity. Okay, it's more on subsistence, not as an economic activity, but as a subsistence strategy. People produce to feed themselves and their families, and it's not enough. And again, why is it difficult? And here we can see the use of inputs, in this case, chemical inputs, fertilizers, which is very low in these regions, which can explain the lower yields. And in the same trend, the use of machinery. Okay, use of machinery very low, explaining the little added value and the low productivity, the low yields in the same regions, and the access to internet and technology, the same trend. This was just to give you a snapshot of the world. So it's different, right? The global south and the global north are different. And this is then reflects on what people have to eat. And this is from a book, a photo book on diets and cost of diets. And this Peter Menzel is a photographer that traveled around the world, and he took pictures from a representative in different countries, from a representative family with the food they have available for 1 week for the families. And this is shot, as you can see, this is clearly not a good diet for the family. Mali, and notice not only the amount of food and the type of food that they have available, but also the size of the family. Okay, big families, which is also relevant. Ecuador, more on vegetables, but still large families, vegetables and calorie, potato and rice and grains. Bhutan, Mongolia. Here we can see some meat. Turkey, Mexico, a huge number of Coca-Cola over there. Kuwait, giving importance to water. Okay, Kuwait, Norway, Japan, United States of America.
Wow.
Okay, I think this is self-explanatory, right? I'm moving because. And Germany. So when we look at this, we see that food is not the same thing, and the priorities are not the same for the whole world. It's very different, and the global policies and the global discourse is not appropriate for all regions in the world. And here we can see what are the social demands and expectations from agriculture to each region. And we see that in the least developed countries, the priority is getting agriculture moving, meaning that farmers should be more productive, okay, more commercial farmers, and not only subsistence. So the priority is increase the economic value of agriculture. Then we know that agriculture can be used as an engine of growth. And the priority is that when some farmers start to be more commercial and more effective, they can generate jobs, and then they can improve. And then the priority is now poverty reduction by formal jobs and by making it farming a commercial and economic activity. Then we have a stage of integrating agriculture into the macroeconomy. Okay, and in this case, is like the development of farming together with the development of other sectors like industry, tourism, services, should not lead to any social instability, like unemployment, for example. And then in the industrial economies in the so-called developed countries, what people ask from farmers and from the agricultural sector is environmental quality and cultural values. So people are not worried about food anymore. Okay, it's kind of an assumption. So most of the society looks at the agricultural sector as something that is a risk for the environment, a risk for the landscape. So what citizens ask for from agriculture is attention to environmental quality and cultural values. So here we also see a difference, a big difference between different contexts. And this is what in the examples that I showed can be representative. But we need to feed a growing population. And some of you probably are aware of, familiar with the Malthusian theory, saying that if the resources are finite and the population keeps growing, there is a moment in which we don't have resources and the population will drop by wars and famine, etc. But there is this less known ideas from this lady, Esther Boserup, that proposes something different, saying that when the population grows, the resources, the pool of resources can increase or can be expanded if we adapt to it by knowledge, by technology. So a regime shift. And there is a point in which we as humans can come up with solutions, innovative solutions. They can be on the organization, not necessarily on technology. Some solutions, and then we can now have other ways of assuring our resources. And what we know from agriculture, of course, it has an impact on the environment. So keep the idea of Boserup. We will see later on in this final part. We know that food and agriculture have an impact on the environment. It contributes to 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions, 50% of the habitable land, excluding the ices and etc. The habitable land of the planet is occupied by agricultural production. So half of the planet is for agriculture. 70% of the withdrawals of fresh water are used in agriculture. It's not wasted, it's used, but still it's a good number. 78% of contamination of water bodies with nitrogen and phosphorus leading to eutrophication are the result of agricultural activity. And biodiversity, the crops and the animals, particularly in the mammals, if we consider the total number and the total weight of mammals in the planet, we are largely exceeding what is wild from replacing what is grown for food. And this is one idea that I would like to highlight, is that we have a bias for the greenhouse gas emissions when it comes up with agriculture. There is some other impacts on the environment, but we have a bias on the greenhouse gas emissions. That's why we still advocate for solutions that suggest that we should modify our behaviors and our ways, our diets and our behaviors. But if we look at the cropland use, blue water use, nitrogen and phosphorus application, we see that in this case, modifying our behaviors is not the solution, but technology is the solution. So one message, we have here a bias for the greenhouse gas emissions when it comes up with environmental sustainability. This is the same graphic, because we are now in this context. Let's focus on the developed countries now. We also have a bias for the environmental dimension of sustainability. Sustainability has 3 dimensions: environmental, social, and economic. And why does this bias comes from? Because the concept of sustainability is long known, and in the first approaches to the concept, if something was not profitable, it would not be economically sustainable, it will be failing in the short term. So sustainability was a synonym of economic behavior. Then, if it introduced some inequalities to the society, it will not be socially sustainable, and it will be failing. And the environmental part was something in the long term. Okay, so it was not the priority. But with the climate changes, we even call it the urgency, the climate urgency. What happened is that the environmental dimension was moved to the short term. And this changed all the way that we see sustainability. So we now know that we have sustainability, the concept is different in space and is different in time. And this is reflected, and I think I'm getting closer to the time, right? Okay, and when we ask farmers about the common agricultural policy, we see that farmers in Europe, of course, want from the policy a reduction in the administrative burden, addressing market challenges, ensuring fair standard of living for farmers, and more targeting for real and small farmers. But when we ask the other citizens, what they want from the agricultural policy is sustainability, animal welfare, consumer protection, organic and local production, and support to environmental friendly farms. So again, the focus of the global north and of the developed countries is very much not on the food production from the citizens. Due to this requirement and stress of the citizens for a sustainable way of producing food, we now have a huge amount of movements and practices associated with sustainability of food production. Okay, and we have organic farming, intercropping, permaculture, syntropic agriculture, regenerative agriculture, conservation agriculture, climate smart, and everyone has his own preference. But when we look carefully, we should consider only 2 pathways for increasing sustainable intensification of agriculture. So producing more, keeping sustainability standards. And one definition is the sustainable intensification pathway. The other one is agroecological intensification. The sustainable intensification pattern means that we should reserve some area to produce food And in this area, we should apply all the best technology that we have, including seeds, GMOs, digital tools, inputs to produce more in less area, and of course having a minimum impact on the environment possible. On the agroecological intensification, on the other hand, it's like using ecological science for landscape management. So it's managing the space in a way that we can obtain some also at the same time obtain some food out of it. Okay, so it's like a design relying on ecosystem services, and it's something that is more holistic. It's not just saving some area and produce there. It's like managing the landscape, and at the same time we can obtain food from there. And I'm not going into this, and then I can share the presentation, but they differ in their actors, concept, vision, science opposition. But I want to highlight the paradigm of land use. The land use is what I mentioned. We have this debate about land sharing or land sparing, which is exactly this. Land sharing on the agroecological intensification way is like I will share my production with nature. Land sparing is I will produce in this area, and then the remaining keeps untouched and live undisturbed for nature. And this is a big debate leading to, this is a representation, so the number of green dots is the same. On the land sparing, I concentrate my activity on an area, and then the other part is for wildlife. And on the land sharing, I will share the land with nature. And of course, there are some other economic and social dimensions, as I mentioned. But what is relevant here, just to finish, is that okay, sorry, is that the best practices are using the best systems are using practices from one pathway and the other. But there is the narrative that so the two concepts differ less in their definition than in their discourses, and we have a society split it into different approaches. Either you are with me or you are against me. So we have this idea of us and you. So I use this approach and you use your approach, and the context will define to we and them. If you are not agreeing with me, you are doing wrong. Okay, but both ways are valuable and compatible. And I will skip this. So, but in reality, the choice should be according not to ideology, but with some type of criteria. And the criteria is the availability of using ecosystem services or external inputs. And again, I will skip this. So we can rely, or we can choose in each concept if we prefer some agroecological intensification pathway or some sustainable intensification pathway. If we are relying on external inputs or ecosystem services, and if we want territorial embeddedness, so we need to manage our landscape because we are worried about our territory, or if we want to be competitive in the global market. So the type of agriculture should follow these four dimensions, and the selections should be very clear and very oriented and guided by a political decision or about what would be the development in a given context. Here I can also leave this saying that, so in Europe, we are now, because citizens are asking for sustainability, and agroecological intensification has been on top of the agendas. But several research papers are questioning the proper use of agroecology in the global south. Okay, deserves a firmer scientific base, stands to protract farmer poverty, is wrong. The input reduction of agroecology is wrong when it comes to mineral fertilizer used in sub-Saharan Africa. So again, solutions in the global north should not be the same applied blindly to the global south. These are my final slides. So global solutions, just to highlight the danger and the risk of applying global solutions. Even something like fertilizer use, which we all associate with something bad to the environment, and looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, we can say that if we use an optimum, we are on the Sustainable Development Goal 12, responsible consumption and production. If we use too much, we are compromising the environment on land and water. But if we use too little, in some contexts, we are still going against sustainability, because we are compromising sustainable development: 1, poverty; 2, zero hunger; and 3, health. Okay, because people are still facing food insecurity. So instead of applying global solutions, we should have targeted solutions for agriculture with the proper concept of sustainability framing this. And sorry for taking this long, and we can also discuss.
At the end, we can have some questions.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation and for your presentation, Claude. It's a pleasure to be here. So thank you, Luís, for your presentation, because it was really a nice introduction for my presentation. We didn't agree about the topics, but indeed they are aligned. So I'm Anabela Raimundo. I come from the same institute, from Instituto Superior de Agronomia, and we belong to the same research center, that is LIF. I mainly work in the other side of the chain, of the food chain, not with agriculture, but with food. So we go from farm to fork in our LIF, in our research center, but I'm in the fork part of the business. So I will talk you about, related with this framework, with the difficult to have to ensure food for everybody, for all the world. I will talk you some topics related with our work in my group, that is the group Food and Feed, where we use different strategies to obtain different nutrients, namely proteins, minerals, and so on, looking for other sources of food, okay? That is the scope and the title. So the general framework was really well presented by Luís. We are in a very difficult period, because we are facing a lot of problems, not only the most common things, but we are facing high increase in the world population. It is expected to have more than 9 billion people in a few short period of time in 2050. And we have a lot of people to feed, but at the same time, we are facing problems with scarcity of water, of arable land, as was mentioned, and biodiversity, of course, and mainly scarcity of protein. And protein scarcity is really a very important topic, and we have to rethink our diet and also our behavior related with food in order to think that we have to incorporate in our diet alternative sources of protein. I will not say that we have to stop to eat meat, we have to stop to eat fish, not at all, but we have to combine these traditional proteins with other proteins that are available and we can use. So in our group, we work in a straight relation with the food industry. We have a lot of projects with ITRL. I mean, that are developed with companies in order to obtain final products to go to the market. We have several well-known partners like Sona IMC, Casa Mendes Gonçalves, that is the owner of the brand Paladin, with Primor, with Small Compound, so the big companies, and we are doing an effort to combine different formulations with alternative proteins and alternative ingredients, and to go to the market, to launch in the market this type of products. We are working within the PRR agendas. I don't know if you have heard about that, but there are big projects where we establish collaborative innovation, and until the end of this year, 2025, is mandatory to go to the market with new products. So please pay attention, because you will find a lot of products. Some of them were previous launch, are available in the market, but we will find a lot of products, namely with microalgae and insects. Please pay attention and remember this talk when you find this type of product. So when we work with the industry, one thing is really important. We have to be in line with the food trends. And all the years, there are a lot of marketing companies and so on that launch the main food trends for this year. And in the last years, the trends are almost the same, and are mainly related with upcycling. I mean, reuse some byproducts that we produce in the industry. This is upcycling, to incorporate the byproducts in the food chain again. We also have a lot of demand of plant-based products, you know, that is a trend. Also sustainable ingredients, the consumers look for this type of issue, or, I mean, products that promote sustainable production, sustainable cultures and so on. So it's a very important topic. Also the tech to table, I mean, the technologies. It's very important in the food industry. The snackification is another trend. I mean, snackification now, all of you are always eating snacks, and this is really a very important movement in the industry, the snackification. And also, of course, to explore, the consumers like to explore alternative textures. So these are the main topics related with the food trends that we are working with. So in terms of upcycling, circular economy, we have a lot of byproducts in our industry. Like, for instance, if we think in rice, we have the bran, we have broken rice, and so on, that we can use and produce and incorporate it in the food industry. If you look for fruit, when we produce juice, the peels and the pulps, we can have this. We call it a very important byproduct for our food chain. And a lot of examples that we could explore, but we also have other underexploited sources. And what is this? For instance, insects. Who tastes insects now? Nobody? You? Okay. So it's a trend. We have to look for insects as an alternative source of protein. And microalgae or seaweeds, I mean algae. Too? The same. Okay, so the others have to think about that. I'm always working with students, and I'm saying, so you didn't taste it yet, but you have to think about that, because in the near future, you have to consider to have a position that will be not neophobic. So nowadays we have a lot of neophobic people, and you have to reduce your level of neophobicity, because it's really important to rethink and redesign your diet, okay? And these are two important elements, the microalgae and insects. I could have in this presentation other alternatives, like cultivated meat. You have heard about lab meat. That is a term very complex, but now we don't use this term. It's cultivated meat. We are working in our group with cultivated octopus. We produce octopus cells, not us, but the company, and we use the octopus cells to produce foods, different types of foods based in these cells, okay? I could also talk about mycoproteins and others. There are a lot of alternatives, so don't be panic without the future that I'm saying we will not have protein for everybody. No, it's not true. We'll have proteins, but you have to open your mind to incorporate other proteins in our diet. This is the main issue. I will try to be fast. So when we look for this type of alternative proteins, for instance, for algae, and I will focus a little bit in algae, okay? We also have other ingredients, as I will show you then, not only the proteins, but all the others that can play an important role in our diet and to have the topic of security, food security, as Luis mentioned before. This is an example work developed with insects. In this case, we use 3D printing technique. We have a lot of different processing techniques to obtain food. And in this case, 3D printing technique is a very important technique or tool because we can create beautiful foods with very appealing textures. And this is a strategy to engage the consumers and to say, oh, this is really beautiful. I will try. And then you can, it's the first step is really important to engage the consumers. Okay, so you use a lot this type of technique. And the insects now are really recommended by the European community. And we have a very important role. Portugal has a very good production of insects, and we are prepared for this protein. It is a challenge, of course, as you can imagine, but we have good industries working with insects. And now we have approved 9 species of insects that can be used in our food. And you will explore this in the near future if you want or not, because we have no alternative. So in this case, we have high levels of protein. As you can see here, we can find around 60% of protein is too much. And it's good protein in terms of nutritional composition, but we also have important sources of fatty acids and antioxidants. Is really important. Is a very complete and a very complex nutritional and well-balanced nutritional composition we can find in the insects, okay? So please take a look of this. Your students, when will be teachers, will use these proteins and they are more able to engage this. Microalgae. So I started to work with microalgae in food in 2000. So in my group, we have around 150 papers published with microalgae, with incorporation of microalgae in different types of foods, because they have a huge impact in terms of production, in terms of sensory evaluation, in terms of nutrition, and the impact of this nutrition in our health is really important. If you would like to learn a little bit about this, you can search for several papers and also from book chapters that are available. I will not give you a lot of scientific details, otherwise it will be a little bit difficult. But what I can say, what is a microalgae? Who knows? What is a microalgae? Oops. So microalgae works like a bacteria. It's not a bacteria, but works like this. It has the capacity to have photosynthesis in order to convert the CO2 in oxygen. But they are really, really good producers of oxygen. So they produce around half of the oxygen we have in our atmosphere, in the world. You can imagine they are microscopic organisms with a huge capacity to produce oxygen from CO2. As you can imagine, they have a very important impact to mitigate the CO2 that is a very important problem, as you know. So we have, it's difficult to look here because I have a problem. So we have the photosynthesis. They can use the CO2, produce oxygen, but in the meantime, they produce lots of bioactive compounds like vitamins, minerals, and other bioactive compounds. Bioactive compounds are compounds that have a specific role in our health. And you have here some examples, like, I'm sorry to be like this, but I can't read anyway. So we have the fatty acids, the polyunsaturated fatty acids. We have already heard about this. WEPA and the DHA have already heard about this. They are really important. We also have vitamins, pigments that have a huge importance in terms of antioxidant activity. And related with all these components, you have the bioactivity. So we have already published papers showing this bioactivity, not only on my group, but other groups, namely antibacterial, antiviral, anti-carcinogenic, immunomodulatory, and so on. So we can prove now at this stage, we can have a relation between the microalgae composition and the benefits on health, okay? So let's do this. Everybody's saying, so, but this is a new food. No, this is not a new food. This is an ancient food. And there are very old stories about the use of this algae. Luis told about shad. We agreed in this presentation, no, it's not true. This is an example. This is a recent example of a project that is supported by FAO, and it is developed in the Shad River. And as you can see here, this is just a women business. Men are forbidden to be engaged in this business. So they can, they control the production of spirulina in the river. They collect the spirulina and they dry spirulina with the sun. Just a break, because we will be teacher of science, and spirulina is not a microalgae, it's a cyanobacteria, but we deal with this like a microalgae, okay? Because they have the same way to be produced and so on. Just this break. They dry the spirulina in the sun, and then they prepare these bars, small bars, that they can sell in a local market, and they call it DA. This is one cultural product from shad, and it has been a very important role to fight malnutrition problems of this population. So it is used by ancient countries, by ancient times in different countries. Okay, this is just an example. There are a lot of stories about this, but I have no time. So in terms of agriculture, we told about sustainability related with agriculture, with the use of land. In this type of culture, so we can have the cells of the microalgae from the ocean, okay, because they are in the beginning of the food chain for the fishes. They are in the phytoplankton. We can obtain these cells, isolate these cells, and then we can grow them in a lab. Then we can collect and dry. And if you look in the market, you can easily find packages of spirulina or chlorella or things like that, okay? They have a very interesting thing. I have mentioned they have high capacity, high productivity in terms of photosynthetic point of view, high capacity to convert CO2 in oxygen. But another topic that is, it's not necessary to use arable land to produce microalgae, because they can grow everywhere, including in non-arable land, okay? This is a very important feature, because we can have production everywhere, because they will produce in photobioreactors, and photobioreactors are structures like this. Portugal, just to say that Portugal is pioneer in the production of microalgae biomass. We have a big company that is Necton, was the first one, and we had another one that was microalgae, they joined, and we have other important companies, but this is one of the most important company in the world, and we have really good biomass and different ways to produce biomass adapted to different situations, okay? Also in Spain, we work a lot with this company that is Phytoplankton Marino, and so we have here, this is a very positive topic you can use, because we can explore it very easy. You can go to the website, All Microalgae, and you can find, and you can buy the biomass directly. I have no commission about that, but anyway. And one problem that we have to deal with insects, we also have with microalgae. That is the approval of microalgae species by EFSA. EFSA is the European Food Safety Authority. It's a nightmare. Sometimes we can have 10 years to approve a microalgae. This was, we have a long story related with Tetracell Michui that is produced by Phytoplankton Marine in Spain. They took 10 years to approve this microalgae. Last year was very good because we had around 9 species approved, and all the information we give about the microalgae, it's necessary. A lot of money and a lot of work to be approved. But when it is approved, okay, we can have other ideas, and that, because each microalgae has different nutritional profile, okay? And depending on the way they are cultivated, we can manipulate the protein content, the fatty acids content, and so on. The medium conditions are really important for the final product, just to give you an idea. So if you go to the market, few products are available. These are some products that are in the market, and you can recognize one from the Portuguese market, that is this mayonnaise do mar. Now we will launch with the Paladin other mayonnaise do mar with a green color, because this mayonnaise do mar has few amounts of algae. It has a macroalgae and the microalgae. Macroalgae are the ones that you can catch in the coast, okay, the biggest. But now we are reformulating it, and you will have in the market another mayonnaise do mar with green color. It is a challenge. To accept the green color by the industry is really a challenge, and for the consumers also. So, we have a few, and the IKEA is also working with microalgae. This is a hot dog with the spirulina bread, and inside the sausage is from insects, okay? It's not available in Portugal, I'm so sorry. So, in our group, in ISA, at our institute, we have food engineering, and we also have food gastronomy, okay, are 2 different masters. And we are always working with the people from food gastronomy, because related with what I said, the first impact of a product is really important. So these people can create very innovative products. And of course, we study all of this related with bioactive properties and so on. But the first step is really, really important. Sonia is my PhD, is finishing her PhD, and all the work was developed with microalgae, namely with 3D printing, but also with different variations and with different competitions in food, about food and food innovation and so on. This is the 3D printing, just to give you an idea. We have to have creativity. It's important when you have a new ingredient in your at home. The first thing you have to do is to be creative, to have different formulations. How can I use it? And this is the same mood that you have to use microalgae. How can I pair this microalgae with other ingredients? Because you have to face the green color. The majority of them are green. We have others that are orange, but not so much. And you have a slight fishy flavor. So you have to manage your composition in order to mitigate this fishy flavor, because some people don't like it. And this is a work that we have been developed in terms of sensory evaluation, but also with chromatograph techniques in order to define the volatile compounds that are related with each microalgae. I will move faster, just finishing. One thing that is really, really important when we have a new ingredient, when we want to go to the market, and when we want to say to our population, you have to use this in a near future, is the communication. So communication is a key role for innovation. I will find. Communication is a key role for innovation. And who can be the most important partner in this role? The future teachers. So you have a very important role in this field, because you have to communicate to our students the importance of these new sources of proteins. And in our institute, we have all the months, I can say, students coming from different schools. Now is a trend to have from international schools. We have a lot of visits from this type of schools, but others. And they come to our lab and they will taste for the first time products with insects, products with algae, and normally they like it because it's important to engage the consumers and engage the young generations. So we decided to create some materials that can be used by the schools, by everyone, and I will share with you very briefly. This one is a recipe book that was developed. All of these chefs, they are working now, some of them has their own restaurants, like, no, it doesn't matter because you don't know. But they decided to have a book of recipes with very simple recipes and the others more related with fine dining approaches. So this book is, for me, it's very interesting. It was developed within a project, a European project that was Yum Algae Project. And the main goal of this project was to use enzymes in order to mitigate the fishy flavor of the algae. It was developed with a very important industry, Portuguese industry, producers of microalgae. And in this book, you can explore different approaches. Now we have a lot of students working with taking these recipes as a base, but looking for them for the impact on health, in environmental, looking for the LCA, and so on. This is the book of recipes. This book that is available, is online available, is a very beautiful book. It's a story of the tiny mite that will save the planet. It's a very small microalgae, and he can tell you all the story related with its life, and he will explain to the children how he can has the power to save the planet. Of course, I don't believe that algae will save the planet, but it's a very interesting idea to share with the students and so on. And this one, and these are a lot of jokes, it's a very interesting, you can find it. I can send you the link in order to explore. I forgot to have here the link. And this is another, I could give you a lot of examples. This is an example of the project we developed with Norway. We work a lot with Norway. That was Algae to Future. And in this project, we have an activity just devoted for the young generations. Here is an example with students from the high school where we prepare the meals with our chefs, and then they are tasting the meals. It's the first contact with algae. All the meal was performed with algae. So it's and you can, if you go to the internet for this project, A2F project, we have a lot of videos, very interesting videos, educative videos to be used. This one was launched. I forgot because I have here the Portuguese version, but we also have the English version. This book was launched this month, okay? And it will be available everywhere. And it's also a story about the teacher that went to visit to the ocean with the students, and they explore the wonderful world of algae. Okay, I invite you to it will be very easy to find it in 1 month or two, because now I think it's not available in all the stores. So messages to take home. So these are beautiful photos of our group. We have a lot of people working in this topic. We have no alternative. Our diet will change. If you want or not, it's true. So you have to be prepared for that. We have to reduce your neophobic feelings. And microalgae and insects are really excellent sources of protein that can be used and can be explored. And it's fundamental to engage the consumer. And educating the consumers is the very fundamental step, and you have a very important role in this feature. So thank you very much for your attention.
I don't know if you have any questions for our guests.
There's no information about population growth and population stabilization in different hemispheres, vertical orientation. So we know that certain cultures or certain countries have their population decreasing, which also leads for food safety. So we have non-homogeneous population growth. And that's also part of the food problem, which was not mentioned. And second, I'm a bit hesitant. Although I like the new technologies, I'm pro technology, etc., no problem with that, but the more food we have available to us, the harder it is to control population explosion, which may mean, and we are more embedded into the Earth's ecosystems. And when stuff does not go well, just a war or a natural catastrophe, the backlash in famine is way worse. And that was not mentioned. So we are kind of talking about, we are kind of defending or advocating infinite population growth. And that's not how matter circulates in the world. We know that there's a limit. There's a limit in carbon, there's a limit in sulfur, in magnesium, and that's part of us. The more we are, the less the world is. And that part is not mentioned. That's the only cautionary tale that just brings to the table. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
So, of course, I agree completely with you. The population growth is when we talk about this, we are talking in a general way. We don't divide the different countries or the different continents, and this is an error, of course. We talk in a general way. We will have this amount of people to feed, but we have completely different scenario when we look for Africa, when we look for Europe, or other continent, but Luis underline this topic. Of course, it was more interesting. In general, what we can say that we will have scarcity of protein. This is true. It's no way to overcome this. Of course, the way how we go to Africa or how we go to Europe with solutions is completely different. Of course, I will not produce 3D printed food to go to Africa with food, right? So, but one thing is common, we have to teach to all the population how they can shift the diet to the more sustainable solution and more nutritional solution. This is obvious, okay? I don't remember the other topic you...
Limits.
Okay, the population is not growing in an infinite way. If you look, you will have the stabilization in the top, and I agree with you, it was completely impossible to have an infinite growing of the population. The forecasting for this is not related with the infinitive growth. Okay.
I just mentioned that of the Malthusian point,
Which was mentioned
Yes,
in both
it was also
presentations.
presented in my presentation.
at the same time, we know that algae, insects, different types of food, although they are nutritious, humans have different capacity to process things. That's why, for example, meat and fish are really important in impoverished countries because they're more easier to get nutrients out of for humans than vegetarian diet. And I just and I don't know if these new technologies actually are putting us in direct confrontation in the cycle where we consume food. But when we start, my worry is if we start consuming at the lower base of the food pyramid, that we are direct opponents to a lot of life. We are starting to consume insects, we are starting to consume to need certain agrarian lands. So some other species will be seen as undesirable and we might see with this new evolution a new extinction wave of a lot of species. Insect species in some what do you call it? In their life in some parts because they are considered plagues.
No, but let me tell you one thing. We are talking there. We have insects and insects, and the wild insects. We are not catching the larvae of Tenebrio and so on from the nature. We are cultivating insects in a very controlled conditions. These insects are cultivated like a factory of insects. Can you imagine? They have the boxes. They are fed with specific nutrients, namely with upcycling nutrients, with byproducts from the food industry that can be used to feed the insects, and all the nutritional composition of the insects is predicted according the life cycle, according the food, the way we feed it, and so on. Okay, it's completely different. We are not removing insects from the environment and using them for our food. They are specifically produced for this way, but is a very sustainable production with a very high protein content in this type of source. Okay, it's much more easy to produce a cow or a chicken and so on. But I'm not saying that we have to stop to eat meat. It's to combine different protein sources.
So maybe I can add on this. Yeah, I fully understand the issue about the population not being growth at the same pace in the whole world even reinforces these messages, both our messages. Of course, population is stabilizing or even decreasing in Europe and in North America, but it's expected to stabilize by the end of the century, or to start decreasing by the end of the century in Asia, but still increasing in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is why it is very important to understand the different challenges and the different priorities in different regions of the world, because in the exact same region that the population is growing is where the food is less available. Okay, so the priorities in the countries that see the population decreasing and that are even abandoning agricultural land and returning it to nature, because they can produce the same food in less land, or start using agroecological approaches for the territory, as I was mentioning. It's a risk to apply that in sub-Saharan Africa, in which population is still booming. But most importantly is the desire of everybody is that the continent develops. And we are observing at the same time a growing middle class in Africa. And in Africa, when people comes out of poverty to the middle class, the first thing that they want to do, and I mentioned preferences, because food is emotional. It's not only energy. The first thing that they want to do is start eating a beef, eating cow.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, like in our cases, when we have something to celebrate, we go to sea fish usually. So it's the same thing. We use food as celebration and as a way of living and sharing our emotions. And with the expected and desired development of Africa, a huge amount of the world's population, hopefully, having some access to food, the pressure on protein is even higher. It will be even higher, and that's an impact, a global impact. Okay, and of course for meat, for most protein, there is this global trend that the globalization is very high. Most of the cows that are consumed come from South America, but even the feed to feed the animals is growing. Brazil and South America and Russia and Ukraine, but there is this big telecoupling of events about the population. The example of Annabella is a clear demonstration of the theory of Esther Bostrup in contrast with Malthus. So as we see the limitation of protein, some new ideas appear.
That's it, exactly.
So and we increase our pool of proteins that were not expected, and that's the Borsupian theory in contrast with Malthus. So of course there is a limit, we know that, but the limit cannot be defined at this moment, because history tells us that until some point humanity can come up with solutions and can be innovative, and not only technology but also knowledge. So yeah.
Can I ask only to wait a moment, because we will stay here and we can talk in Portuguese. But they want to go out, so I don't know if they have any question. So other question, we will start the second phase of this seminar in presence. So goodbye and thank you very much for your presence.